Hello, welcome to another live hangout, not so much only on the Living Income Guaranteed, but more as the Equal Life Foundation, the group of people that we are, as people that are aware of the situations that are going on in this world, and with this upcoming situation in Paris, we have all decided that it is our responsibility to share our perspective, some common sense to ground ourselves when we are kind of taken by the hand by the mainstream media into a bandwagon of taking a side, diminishing the perspective on the situation, and of course referring to the Paris attacks that happened yesterday, Friday night. And we are here precisely to share what we've been discussing as a group of people that do push for not only the creation of an awareness that considers responsibility and how we all co-create this world, but also to be informed a little bit more as to how this kind of events can be used for further situations like propping up wars and creating discontent in people's minds to say it is okay to attack further if we've been attacked. So we will be discussing about war, terrorism, the manufacturing of consent for war, the creation of awareness of how we react to these kind of events, and many more things. We are here discussing not so much as a scheduled interview, of course, this is an emergent one. And we are here with Yogan from the US. Hi, Yogan.
Hi, everyone.
And Joku, who we also had earlier on in another hangout related to war. So hi, Joe, again, and thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So to begin our discussion, I'd like to remind our viewers that we do have questions, comments open for any of us. This is an open conversation, and we definitely encourage it, not only particular questions, but maybe any idea that has been in your mind around the situation, or maybe sharing how you reacted, what you think it is or isn't, so that we can all share perspectives and come to a realization and outcome that does not polarize people further into this already war-torn world, but rather ground ourselves in what is being shared around in mainstream media as World War on Terrorism. So why don't we start on this point, Joe Cook? Can you tell us your perspective on this whole event?
Yeah, it's very interesting how reminiscent this event is to other events that have unfolded within our past several decades. What we tend to see happen is an event such as an attack will happen, and the news media will very quickly act almost as if they were concerted and organized to do so, and come up with a narrative. And the narrative that we're hearing now is that this is an attack, a terrorist attack from ISIS. And I find it very interesting that this narrative came so quickly. I seriously doubt enough time has been put into a proper investigation or consideration of the events. I mean, last I checked, they were still trying to figure out the amount of gunmen that were involved and the total body count. Yet, we have this narrative coming out already that this is, in fact, a terror attack coming from ISIS. And those two words, terror and ISIS, are being constantly impulsed, just as we've seen before with Al-Qaeda, and just as we've seen before with the Boston Marathon bombing. This is very much in the same vein as those events, where already it seems like we are being primed to go into a certain conclusion and to make decisions about this event without having all of the facts for ourselves or doing our own investigation.
I would say that it is also part of how we immediately as human beings jump into conclusions when being shocked, and as Kelly also mentioned in the previous hangout, with the shock doctrine, and how with things like 9/11 and any other terrorist attack throughout history, people are then triggered into their primal reaction, which is fear. And what can you tell us about this, Yogan, in relation to people's response to this event?
Yeah, so, when I started looking at people's responses to what was happening online, and I started to do my own little writing on that and reflected a little bit on that. And I started seeing that, the primary emotion you feel is like a fear. And within that, looking at the situation, it seemed evident that it has to do with self-interest, a fear for your own survival, because here you're having a headlining news about a first world country, a first world city that's being attacked. And for some reason within that context, that story, it brings up a fear that, okay, if they can attack that place, they can probably attack me where I am. And everyone who's on social media and everyone who is watching news, I mean, all these people are like from the first world countries. They're living very luxurious lifestyles that are far away from all the wars that are happening out in the world in other countries, and all the hardships. And then when you hear these news, it's like these sense of fear within you, which identify as just being like, okay, well, I'm afraid for my own survival. Maybe we should go to war because I need to protect myself and other people, or my families, my loved ones. So that's really what I saw. Yeah.
And it's also to consider that, yes, people died in this attack, but I also, for example, saw how also what happened with Charlie Hebdo and that terrorist attack, and how everyone started placing the Je suis Charlie, and creating this hype around only siding with the people that were attacked. A perspective is missed in relation to how terrorism is actually created. Why do people suddenly want to attack? Is that really who we are as human beings? Or are there other situations that we don't really get to see, hear, or even investigate on that have actually been the actual cause of, for example, people suddenly deciding that it's time to take vengeance, create a backlash upon the terrorism, the wars that have been actually propagated and sponsored by, let's be honest, countries like France. So, Joku, what can you tell us on this?
Well, here we have to go into a bit of historical context about war and how specifically the Western foreign policy has created a lot of backlash against the United States and its allies. And this is interesting because when we talk about groups such as Al-Qaeda or ISIS, we really have to understand that Al-Qaeda had its origins from the United States directly funding and training them. Al-Qaeda is a creation of the United States foreign policy. They were created back in the 70s and into the 80s to help the United States keep Russia out of certain territories that the U.S. had interest in. And that was what created the Mujahideen, and that's what created Al-Qaeda, and that's what led to Osama bin Laden, who actually was an operative for the United States. This is all declassified public information. We see this again happening, the same trend with ISIS. Again, ISIS was trained, funded, and their equipment was greatly supplied by the United States. So when we now say that we have this terrorist organization as though they came out of the blue, or as though they were some kind of natural outspring of the Middle East Islamic, not fascism, but Islamic extremism, I think that's incredibly unfair to the American public, who may not have had the time to do the proper research. And also, it shows the degree to which our media has been controlled and, to a large extent, been accomplices to furthering a political narrative instead of providing the public with actual, truthful reporting.
Yeah, when I hear that, it sounds like a very typical Hollywood movie. Like, you have the bad guys come up and they're like the perfect, villain to fight for, and they're like pure evil and all this stuff, and then that gives the perfect justification. Well, now we have to be the heroes and save the day, and it really just seems like a really bad script in a way, in that sense. And that's like how the media works, right? It's like how it's presented, like the whole fear point and everything.
Exactly. That's also what we were following yesterday with the updates and how mainstream media immediately Obama came out and said, we will do whatever we can to be on the side of France. Of course, allies are formed, and then you have people saying, great, there's going to be someone that will take responsibility for it and give to these terrorists what they deserve. But as Joku was also mentioning, when we look at who funded the terrorists, we know that it's the same people that are now trying to fight terrorism. So in essence, I do definitely suggest watching the Hangout that was just before this one on the business of war to understand that this is all just a situation that is mostly manufactured for the sake of ultimately money, resources, control, and there is a very specific situation going on as to why we see that this could have happened and why it is beneficial for specifically the EU to use this as a potential excuse, which is already being used to close borders. So, Joku, can you share a bit more on this?
Yeah, it's very interesting the timing of all of this because we have been hearing in the news the refugee crisis. Very quickly, I'm not comfortable with that branding because it makes it sound as though the refugees are the problem, when I would actually say that this is a problem of forced dislocation of a mass amount of people. I think that is the issue that needs to be addressed, not that there are refugees. But having said that, we're seeing that there is a lot of tension that's brewing with the influx of migrants into the EU as a result of displacement from war. And I find it very coincidental that we now have this event, this attack in Paris. And now Paris has the justification to close its borders very conveniently at a time when it's struggling with this migrant issue. It also conveniently has the justification to employ a military police presence, which also helps them out because coming up there is a scheduled climate meeting to be held in France where they were already anticipating mass riots and disruption. So now they also have the excuse of, hey, recently we had this attack. This is why we have a military police presence, not because of us thinking you guys are going to riot. No, they're here for your protection, right? So we see all these layers of justifications that seem to play out a bit too perfectly for it to be coincidental.
I fully agree on this, and it also pushes us to ask, well, we tend to, in moments of absolute fear, just trust the people that we have placed as the major directors of the whole show, which are usually presidents. And in this, we have a comment from Niklas Needle, and he's saying, I also find it quite offensive, to be honest, that Emperor Obama himself, directly responsible for the deaths of countless of civilians and the destruction of countless of homes and families, takes some sort of moral high ground in condemning this and other similar attacks, which I fully agree on. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the American exceptionalism and how bombs, when thrown from America or any other allies, they are considered for freedom and for removing any sort of oppressive government and regime. And when they are thrown by people that have been attacked first, they're called terrorists. So what is going on with this exceptionalism in defining terrorism?
Well, I mean, it's obviously just like you said, an excuse. It's just a way to paint who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, and it's for all the purpose of whoever is taking out the bad guy. So I think this goes into the reason why war exists, and this isn't really taught in history books because when you read history books, you read about different wars, like World War Wars, and World War I, World War II. And then you think, okay, the point of war is to take out people who are evil, whatever. But if you look at all the wars that aren't in history books, like during the Soviet era, all the hidden wars that occurred in various countries across the world, third world countries, they're all directly related to achieving some sort of economic benefit, whether it was access to, let's say, rubber, or some natural resource that isn't available in your country. And so you can set up a monopoly there and have a direct trading to that place, like bananas, or I don't know, in South America. So the same thing with all the other wars. It's like, okay, who are we gonna make the bad guy? And so there we can take them out, and then we get the land, and we get the access to the resources, and we set up our trading to that there. And that's how the whole world's set up right now. First world country. All the first world countries have direct access to all the best resources at a very cheap rate. And yep, that's that story.
Joe, anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's very important to address this for what it is, and it is American exceptionalism. It's this Western-centric view, and it's a monopoly of the word terrorism. I think it's very unfair, and I don't think we should allow this to continue, because why is it only terrorism when it's able to be linked to Islamic extremism? Why is it only terrorists when it's coming from that side? Why is it not considered terrorist when the majority of deaths that have resulted in this war have been unarmed civilians? And let's face it, that's coming from our aggression. It's coming from our drone strikes. It's coming from our aggressive invasion of other territories. It's also coming from this idea that it's terrorism, and so it's justified, as though it's right that we do this kind of aggressive tactic for our defense when we were not attacked by Syria. To go into this point just a little bit deeper, I want to bring up the fact that when we look at that region, what's going on is warfare. It's an invasion force. And what's happening to local infrastructure is, infrastructure is being shut down. There is no infrastructure at all. People are losing their homes. They're living in fear. There's destruction happening all around. Families are being torn apart. People are dying on the street. So is there any wonder still, really, why there is this sense of antagonism towards the United States and its foreign policy? Even if there is Islamic extremism, is that really so far-fetched as a proper response to an aggressor? So this double standard to say that what they're doing is terrorism, but what we're doing is not, is unacceptable. And I would challenge anybody that's seeing this or hearing this in the media to not take that at face value, but to restore your sense of awareness that you are being played, manipulated, and kind of toyed with like a puppet on a string, made to dance to this word terrorism as though they have defined it for you.
Yes, this is the whole process of manufacturing consent for war, and it's already happening. Borders are being closed, and it is being talked that, yes, the attacks will continue in Syria. Of course, we could bring the whole other process of how Russia has intervened and has created effects that the other side hadn't actually accomplished in all of the time and all of the expense that they have had. But ultimately, any attack, any war is never justified, and this is what we want to make very clear. And I place myself in the shoes of the people, the families of people that have lost, not only in this attack, Paris attacks, but overall in war, how you remain with that sense of maybe hatred, vengeance, seeing it as an unjust situation. But ultimately, when taking one side as to saying they are the culprits, I have to hate them, I have to take revenge, we've seen countless of outcomes of the results of doing this, which is joining either terrorism or joining any other form of hateful wings that eventually cause more problems. And from my perspective, what would be more of a sane decision is to say, looking at what has been done to my loved ones as a reason for me to hate back or seek for revenge or consent for war, to create a form of revenge will only cause more deaths and more suffering to other human beings. We ultimately have to consider that this is happening to people, not religions, not races, not nations, but see ourselves as humanity. So, Yogan, I would like to have your perspective on this sense of how wars are usually taken as a reason for revenge and how we usually react to that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, usually we do. I mean, given our history, we usually react to that and we usually just attack. And I mean, I wanted to say how it doesn't make any sense. Like, I mean, everyone thinks this, they're like going to war and killing people. That's like the way to go. But when you really look at it and you slow down and you drop your fears and anxieties, do you really think that going over there and killing someone is the answer? I mean, is that all that we can really do? And you know, that's of course not all we can do. I mean, you could even go as far to say, okay, well, why are they shooting? Where do they get the guns from? Where do they get the bombs from? You know, you can go to that point, like, okay, like how do we remove weapons? How do we remove guns? And like that's one point to consider, that the more afraid we are of other people, the more weapons we produce, and the more weapons we produce, there's more weapons out there that we can get shot with. You know, it's like that same point. And when you add into that, like the common sense, like, okay, we can either kill them or them kill us. That's like a point that's like so diluted from like what we're capable of doing, what we're capable of being, and it's like, we're able to figure out, like, okay, what do they want? Like, what's actually going on? Like, how do we actually support a human being to change and what they are and how we are? I mean, for us as human beings, we're reacting in fear and anxiety, and that's something we don't even understand ourselves. I think that would be like one of the first points to understand, like, why are we reacting in fear and why are we acting out in violence, and will that violence actually end violence or end other people from getting angry? I mean, it won't. It's like we're forever gonna just be killing each other. For what? And it's like we don't even learn our lesson.
Joe, some perspectives have emerged as to say, well, this world is run by psychopaths. What else could we expect? These are false flags. These people only are into the greed, money, for control. So what would you say to a person that only has that one perspective and sees that as, well, it was scripted, it is part of the hidden agendas, it is, it isn't? How would you assist the person maybe to consider other things beyond that?
Yeah, this is a very important element of what we need to discuss today, which is how to not be swayed one way or another when faced with this kind of information. The tendency is to want to understand what happened, and that there's this drive to want to pick a side because it makes it easier for us to cope with and digest and kind of figure out where we're supposed to stand in relation to our peers, with our group, with our nation. So there's a lot of pressure that isn't talked about, which is like you're supposed to root for the home team, right? You're supposed to go with the media portrayal. Or you might be in the alternative crowd. You might be of the persuasion of people that say, this was an engineered event. If you look at history, we have had false flag events before. This falls into the same pattern. This is obviously because of that. The danger, one way or another, is that you tend to narrow your perspective to only one side. It's either a false flag or it's not. It's either engineered by the secret cabal or it's Islamic extremism. This duality is not going to allow you to see past the manipulation that's going on. And this manipulation is coming from yourself, oddly enough. It's very important, especially when news like this is so fresh, to remain in a way grounded within yourself, to take in the information, yes, to allow yourself to listen to people that have perspectives on this, yes, absolutely. But when you find yourself making a decision or leaning one way more than another, you really got to check yourself and make sure that you're not being influenced by pressure, firstly, or by misinformation. and these are critical things that one needs to develop an awareness of.
I would say that this also has to do with how people react in social media, Facebook, Twitter. If you saw what has been going on, let's take the example of people placing the French flag on their Facebook profile as a way to say, I'm with the people that were killed yesterday and the families and so forth, which is okay to have that sort of human compassion, but I also see it as when I place this support for this country, I am directly supporting whichever action they will take as a form of revenge or justification for, taking responsibility for this so-called terrorist attack, whichever way you want to look at it. And so we tend to then take side with each other. In my own experience, what I did is I started getting angry at people just taking that immediate side of pray for Paris and so forth, and kind of completely being forgetting about the ongoing war and situation that's going on in the Middle East, Syria, all the millions of immigrants that are suffering every single day, what is going on in Palestine, for example, and who places a flag of Palestine on their profile as a massive act of solidarity or anything like that. All of those things really polarize each other instead of saying, look, we are humanity and we have to consider how we got to this point, how the ball is already going, and how we might not be able to create immediate peace because these forces are already rolling. But I do see important and a pointed responsibility, in essence, to, as Joku and Yogan are saying, to remain stable, calm within ourselves, and to ensure that we do not take one immediate side. An example is, for example, Peter van Overschot, who is sharing some news that were coming up that there was another shooting going, and it has been rectified that it isn't true, because people are in a state of alarm, like a state of paranoia, sort of. And it's understandable from this perspective of, how we humans in our minds react. But that's precisely why we're coming here and sharing, look, we have to take a step back, ensure that we remain calm and rather understand the reasons why this is happening, so that we do not take one side just because your friends or your family are doing, but rather inform yourself and take from our perspective a stance in an impartial way, which is ultimately one of self-responsibility. And that implies realizing that we've all created a form of war within ourselves. What does that mean, Yogan? And how do we live also that terrorism within ourselves?
Well, I would just say simply that it has to do with emotions like anger or fear. You're afraid of someone hurting you, so you act in anger, and that's what basically war is. And you do it in your mind, you do it with your daily life. You get afraid of someone, you get angry at someone, you get angry at yourself, you get afraid of what's about yourself even. And so, it's natural. I like to use the example of a horror movie. If you're able to be manipulated by a horror movie, then you're able to be manipulated by the media. And the same thing goes. If the reason why that is because in your daily life you're reacting in fear and anger, and it becomes so normal, so common that when something like this happens, where people have that knowledge, understanding of reactions, but instead of helping others, they decide to use it for their own benefit of controlling the populace, controlling the people. So they engineer like their media, their advertisements, their presentations, so that they take advantage of that for their own purposes. And so when we're living that way, we're just open for abuse all the time, and we're kind of the ones doing it to ourselves because we have that ego in there where we actually feel good about it, where we feel good when we're able to be angry and be the one that's right, or even when we're afraid, we're able to feel good sometimes with using fear even. So it's like, it's really like on a very deep level that we've sort of come to this point of how we've always existed. And it's been almost like forever where we've always been in this kind of way, manipulating each other and manipulating ourselves, and it's all starting with our emotions.
One thing I want to jump in on really quickly before we get too far. Marlen, you just mentioned the part of looking at all of this information in a way that is kind of impartial. I wanted to add to that and clarify that this does not mean to be absolutely neutral either. There is this misconception that because you're not actively taking one side over another, that you are kind of like being the Switzerland, right? You're being neutral and refusing to have a principle. When in fact, I would say that the principle should be based on actual reflection, meaning I, within principle, would say that any act of harm and abuse and violence is unacceptable. Those who perpetrated this act of violence, whether it be a false flag event or it be a genuine case of Islamic extremism, is unacceptable. That is a principle that stands regardless of what side that happens to be on. So I would encourage people to not look at it as, oh, are you supposed to not take sides at all? No, I'm saying make a stand in everything and be clear about it instead of going with the prefabricated version of it's either this or that.
Absolutely agree, and yes, it's a great way to also define the word impartial. Maybe it's already like implied within us, but you know, as an organization, as a group, we stand for principles that always imply equality, common sense, what is best for all, taking responsibility. So part of that responsibility is, yes, understanding, just like cause and effect, physical laws. You know that when you are breeding war somewhere, there will be a backlash that creates this kind of terrorism, which then in turn creates consent for people to keep the war going. That is precisely what we have to become aware as a basic process of war, with other intentions that have been discussed also in the Hangout previous to this one, and also to then realize that our stance should be to always look at the greater perspective, the holistic perspective. This means we created this entire world system. There can be so-called bad guys that maybe have more power, more awareness on how to control, direct the world, create an entire system that is for enslavement. It is our responsibility to understand how it works, which is also what we are doing and what the purpose of these hangouts are, and ultimately to not victimize ourselves in these kind of situations. I also agree that this is that one perspective, to not say, oh, sorry, this or that, but realize this is an outflow, a consequence of this other act of attack, war, terrorism, death, deliberately for the purpose of oil, greed, control, enslavement, resources, etc. So we have some comments from Niklas, so I will go to them. He's saying, it's also fascinating that after 15 years of the war on terror, people don't realize that it's clearly not an effective method, but quite the contrary, as it has just escalated and further polarized the world. I fully agree on that. Guys, comments?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting how it's been branded, isn't it? That it's a war on an emotion, and meaning there is no defined goal or endpoint. So we are set up to accept this condition of perpetual war. As long as we have something to point at and say that's terror, the war is going to be in effect in perpetuity.
Yeah, totally agree. I did want to say something else, though I don't know. We should probably answer Nicholas's second comment.
Okay, so let's go to the second one, and he's saying, is the lack of imagination and only seeing violence as a solution a consequence of model learning, meaning having grown up with the state as an authority figure that is founded on the principles of force, coercion, and violence? I would like to first, before you jump in, Yogan, that tomorrow we're going to be having a discussion precisely on anarchism and its sort of reflections, so please be tuned on that. But I also agree that if we look at the relationships that we want to form as human beings, even more so upon seeing the destruction that we're already imposing into this world, upon seeing all of these wars and so forth, it is mostly like the game of a few individuals, yes, that have been placing all of their interest on just, gathering people to have an excuse for war that they only benefit from, whereas ourselves, the regular people, only get the result of people dying, entire cities being decimated, and the violent aspect of it is something then justified by this kind of attacks and situations. So why, let's go now to Nicholas' perspective, Yogan, if you'd like to give a comment on that.
I mean, it seems like that statement's like on a very deep level, meaning that in the home environment, we use violence as a consequence through crime, through education, through our whole entire lives. We have consequences set up. The purpose of it is not to support the individual to learn from the mistake, but as a way of, I guess, serving what we call justice, which is usually just making the victim feel better, I guess, about themselves. And of course, it's also to make sure people are controlled and not actually, let's say, learn, because if you have people that are educated, that have critical reasoning abilities, that do not jump on their emotions, that are able to analyze the situation from all different sides, then they're able to, let's say, live in equality. They're able to see solutions that are outside of what other people are suggesting.
Yeah, outside of that mind frame of it's either war or peace, and peace cannot come without war. That's something that we all got through our history books, that for every minor problem, oh, there's going to be war and there's going to be an apparent solution. But it seems that we haven't ever been outside of this scheme or paradigm. So what's your perspective on that, Joe?
Well, actually, I have a slightly different perspective on this. When I look at that phrase, or this statement, is the lack of imagination and only seeing violence as a solution a consequence of model learning, meaning having grown up with the state as an authority figure? To address that, I would say that that's not necessarily the case all the way around. Certainly this is true in the sense that we live in a society and a world system currently where a lot of the times our political will is not adhered to. Most of the people now are against the war, yet the war will continue regardless of the popular consent. So to say that we are, that this is the only paradigm people have, I wouldn't say that's the case. I would say that there are people who would oppose what's going on and have very strong opinions against what's being done, against our political will. But this doesn't change the fact that, despite our reluctance to support the war, or even in some cases our direct protest against the war still happens. And what's happening within that is there are many dimensions of control that have been wrested away from us that we haven't taken back. And I mean, one layer of this is our own education. And also our access to viable sources of information. When we look at what's going on in the world, when we are kept deliberately in a veil of narratives that conveniently lead us to a conclusion that seemingly fits the same agenda that the ruling elite have, you have to wonder to what extent are our choices actually our own choices. So this is a very vast and deep statement, Nicholas. I doubt we'll be able to get into all elements of that, but I wanted to share that perspective and hope that that contributes to your question.
And ultimately, I would also like to say that in the end, we have the people that we have in power because we've stepped back. We haven't really stepped up to say, okay, look, I'm really going to be a responsible individual within my life, within society, to ensure that no one else is up there giving me orders to become a part of the military or to support wars or things like that. It's all a process that we've all accepted and allowed. We have contracted to it with awareness or without it. And I think that our responsibility is precisely to create this kind of awareness. So if we have existed within this kind of paradigms, it is our full responsibility, and we are fully capable of saying that is no longer the way that we want things to work, just as we all here, and I'm sure that many of you watching right now oppose this, any form of war, oppose any form of terrorism. But the moment that in any way it is justified, we give into the same mechanisms that have been rolling the world around, so to speak. So the whole purpose of creating this discussion is precisely to ensure that we don't create, you know, ultimate culprits of it, to rather understand why people act in particular ways, for which outcomes, benefits ultimately, that within the context of considering life, equality, humanity, they're not beneficial at all. So I'd like you guys to share your perspectives on this.
Yeah, yeah, there's something that I wanted to say, that, you know, the idea of like going to war, that if you consider like there's like a principle that's not really lived in the world, which is to consider what's best for everyone. And that, when I say that, I mean like everyone, like every single person, all sides of the story, all single person. And so when you live that kind of way, you can't create like borders of separation, or like, you know, good guy, bad guy, or polarities. You have to consider what would be best for everyone. Like, how would you support, let's say, the quote-unquote bad guy and the good guy? You know, what would be a solution really that considers everyone? And, you know, when you really look at that point of what it means to, let's say, be human, there are things that we have in common. And, you know, it doesn't, for a person to have a pathological desire to kill other people, that would take years upon years to create through some probably abusive or violent situation. I don't know. And, you know, that doesn't come out of the blue for no reason, you know. And so there are things we can do once we start understanding how we work and as human beings. And when we start considering the principle of what's best for everyone, that will take us to go as far as we need to go in order to actually prevent such things and actually correct them to where they actually are starting. And that's not considered within war. You know, that's not a principle to go to war. That's not really part of what's best for all.
Joe.
Yeah, I would like to bring up the point of, you know, whether or not you are in favor of striking back against these aggressors or not. It's still relevant for you to be able to think things through without an attachment, without being influenced. Because if you look at the situation, in both scenarios, let's say that this was a false flag event engineered so that we have a certain response and that we're geared towards accepting further aggression against Syria. Well, what's going to happen? To us, if we accept that narrative, we're going to be thinking, well, we're striking back at the bad guys, at ISIS, because they hit us. But what actually is going to happen is troops are going to be sent into Syria with that pretext. And are they going to be selectively only killing and removing ISIS? No. What's going to happen is what's been happening, which is countless civilian casualties. Now, let's say they are Islamic extremists. Well, if that's the case, still, is it appropriate that we send in troops into Syria targeting and potentially decimating entire populations based on the actions of a small minority representation of that population? In fact, I don't think it's a fair characterization for Islam to be thrown into this kind of terrorism label, because if you look at those who actually participate in the terrorism, in the violent acts, they are not a representative group or a reflection of the principles of Islam. So to throw Islam in there without that cognizance, without that consideration, is irresponsible. I would advise everybody to stop saying that this is an Islamic terrorist issue. What the fact of the matter is, this is an isolated group of people who are acting in a way that is not acceptable, and that needs to be addressed, but we cannot let that blind us to a point where we're willing to sacrifice and endanger the lives of innocent and unarmed non-combatants just to satisfy some sense of jingoism or nationalism or a sense of defense.
I fully agree, and great that you brought up this point because I fully stand with what you say. It is very common to immediately want to tag just what happened with 9/11. Let's face it, it became part of the Islamophobia, and now it's in Europe, and now further nationalism is being brewed in Europe, and it is spreading like a wildfire, while people do not stop for a moment and consider, wait, how did these people live? What caused them to suddenly want to radicalize if they have radicalized in fact? And to not immediately tag them for a form of race or religion that they might have or not have. And this is part of our responsibility as human beings, to see others as humans that have walked through particular situations that have made them react in other forms that are surely, once again, reactive to what has been done unto them. How to stop that ongoing process of abuse will be a collective responsibility, will be part of the solutions that we have to bring forth. But from the get-go, please, I fully agree, stop labeling, stop creating immediate hatred or fear to a person that you see outside of your street and immediately see as, oh, he's from Islam, he practices Islam, he must be a terrorist, because this is already quite embedded, I see, in Europeans' minds, specifically, probably also Americans, I don't know, and Mexican. But we have a series of comments. So I will go first with Sylvie Jacobs. She's saying, would you say that there is a relation between the deepening of global poverty or little means of existence and radicalization of people? Would not lifting suppressed people out of poverty give substance to freedom, equality, and brotherhood?
Yeah, I'd like to answer that. Yeah, so that's something I was actually going to say, that part of the real solution, which is not war, is, I think, would relate a lot with economic factors. Because you look at a lot of states, for, let's say, the Middle East or these supposed places where they happen, there are places which are very poor, they don't have access to resources, life is harsh. And, I mean, in general, like, if you, let's say, as a people or nation, wherever you are, where you live, if you, like, take care of your people, don't engage in war, and you help everyone else as much as you can, if you give, you will receive. So the more you help others out, others appreciate that, and they help you out. And that's like kind of the principle that needs to be lived, because if the world were to do that, to really focus on, let's say, building education, building all the infrastructure and improving all the infrastructure of life, of what it means to live, and not spending it on guns, weapons, and wars which destroy lives and infrastructure, then you actually will get to a place where it's kind of like exponential, where you support everyone, and people who don't have access to things, you'll be able to get to them. And then, of course, they'll learn from your lesson, your example, and then they'll give to others. And that's kind of like really the only way, is to support everyone as much as you can with what you have and what time you have. And so, even, at least, let's say, I believe that this would even surpass all this, let's say, religious indoctrination. Because if you're a person who is poor, you usually rely on religion a lot because you're poor. You need to pray to God because you need to find a way to get lucky and have some meaning to life, because you're in poverty, you're in suffering, and that usually relates to like the afterlife. But if you take care of your needs here, and if someone were to support you with that, then why would you need a God? Because your needs are taken care of. You actually are fulfilled. So it's like a lot of, if you need to look at the really at a physical level, like how people's needs aren't met, and that is what poverty is. So it's like that would, I think, solve a lot of conflicts and problems, really.
Joe.
Yeah, I would basically agree. But I would add to this by saying that we have to examine the word poverty. Oftentimes we associate this only to a monetary issue, where people that don't have money are in poverty, but we don't look at, okay, but what is the condition of poverty in practical sense? Poverty is when you're not having access to the things that enable you to have a decent life, meaning security, having a house, having access to food, healthcare and education, and reasonable stability within your society. Now, when we look at the impoverished people, they're impoverished because they don't have access to these things. It's not just because they don't have money. Yes, money is an issue, but the problem is that they're denied access that would otherwise make them viable, dignified human beings that can participate equally in the world system. So when we look at this issue of, does the deepening poverty increase the radicalization of people? Yes, absolutely. Because what will you do when you don't have the regular channels to access the things you need? What if you don't have infrastructure because it's been bombed and decimated by war? What if you don't have medical care because there are no facilities, there are no roads, there's nobody there to help you because you're in a war zone? What about education? Forget about education when you're living under constant threat of death and fear. So does the deepening poverty here, meaning restriction and denial of access to these things, increase radicalization? Yes, absolutely. Because when you're denied those regular channels, you will turn to radical methods to achieve those ends for your survival. So that's something very critical for people to understand. This point of radicalization doesn't just come out of the ether. It doesn't just come out of religious indoctrination. It comes out of a real need for people to gain access to the things they need for a dignified living. When those things are denied, we will have radical extremism. We will have crime. So if we want to remove those things and restore that sense of stability, we have to address the economic issue, yes, but really the heart of it is the poverty issue, and that really needs to be elevated.
And also, this has to be understood entirely when people only back again, within the context of the Paris attacks or any other form of terrorism, how people tend to completely miss out on this entire picture of how these people are living right now as a consequence of a historical process where it's kind of obvious the people and the countries that are really wealthy haven't gotten their wealth by the hand of God. They have actually gone out there to colonize, to create essentially a form of colonialism, imperialism that is happening still nowadays, not with such terms, but through corporations as well. And this goes in the hand of, well, it's a free market, it's free commerce, and everyone apparently benefits, but it's not. It's impoverishing people, and it's becoming another reason for war, because then these individuals that are handling the situation want more access to more resources, and ultimately greed and this desire for control and desire for more are aspects that are inherently existent in all of us as human beings. It is ultimately our responsibility to recognize them and to take responsibility to change our ways, which means recognizing that these kind of situations ultimately generate the consequences that no one really wants to see, but that have to be understood, as Joe was saying and as Sylvie brought up, in relation to poverty and ultimately inequality. First world, third world, look at the Middle East, look at what's going on in essentially the South Pole, that has been taken on by the West, and it's still going to be an ongoing source of resources and humans that are also taken as capital for the sake of keeping up with this entire system that we know already and have discussed many times it's not sustainable. So war has become just another gear in that same mentality. And our responsibility is to realize that if we want to change the world in cases and situations like this, we cannot immediately jump on the bandwagon of fear or radicalizing ourselves actually in saying, oh, those are the bad guys. but to really understand this problem within the roots that ultimately comes down to, which is money, which is inequality, which is poverty, which is who's really in control and behind the war industry. And this is part of what we also suggest that you guys also investigate. We have a page and also like a leg of the Equal Life Foundation called Democracy Against War Now, or D.A.W.N, where there's a ton of documentaries and material to understand warfare and also to become aware of how, if we of course stop destinating money to war and instead give that money to provide these basic necessities and these general well-being to people, these kind of things like radicalization would not really exist. So any other comments on these, guys?
No, I think that encapsulates it quite well.
Okay,
Yeah,
so we have other points that we are going to go through, which I consider it's relevant to bring through because of the person that he's speaking. This is from Gabriel Zamora Moreno. And he's saying, in the biography of Malala Yousafzai, who talks about her country, Pakistan, she explains that there is a total breakdown of education in her country. For instance, the Taliban had destroyed 400 schools in 2008 in Pakistan. In that context, many people have no education. Many cannot read, for instance. They are then fed lies about what the holy books say and basically brainwashed and misguided. So this gives a perspective on one of the ingredients of radicalization. So some of these aspects we also already kind of discussed. Any other input, guys?
if you create war, you're going to destroy things in that country, and that will make the people even more desperate. So, yeah.
Just to speak on the point of the radicalization that is so easy to occur in the absence of things like education. And when we talk about education, it's also about developing a sense of being able to have critical thinking and self-awareness and self-agency. When those things are not present, the individual is vulnerable to suggestion, vulnerable to programming, vulnerable to the need to connect to others for survival. And when that survival comes in the form of joining a terrorist group, or any kind of organization that gives them a sense of camaraderie or purpose, that's where they will go in the absence of education, in the absence of social stability, which I consider to be one of the things that should never be infringed upon, should be a basic human right. So yes, that's a very astute thing to be bringing in here, the fact that in the absence of education, you will see the ease of radicalization as people are not given the tools for self-assessment, for critical thinking, for the means to guard themselves from indoctrination.
And many of these people also join in. For example, we've seen it with child soldiers and so forth. We're taking this a bit too far, but it happens that they join military forces because they provide them the necessary shelter, food, if they join into being part of these terrorist forces. This is also part of, once again, inequality, poverty, that children are even subject of. And these are all things that we bring forth because they suddenly take a complete backseat or complete, not even being part of the discussion when only focusing on, oh, there was a terrorist attack. And also going into the education process, not only in people in these countries, but let's take my mother as an example. Yesterday she messaged me that saying, oh, it was so unjust for these people, and being like so heartfelt about the people that died in the concert, for example, in Paris. And so I said, okay, hold on a moment, I will tell you why this is happening. And so I explained precisely what we've been discussing throughout this entire Hangout. And in the end, she was kind of able to change her perspective from only feeling bad, sad, and maybe frightened about the situation and what the possibilities of it could be, to rather understanding, oh, okay, this is a backlash situation, and this is something that essentially has been created in order for, other purposes that we've also been discussing, for power, for revenge, for greed, for resources, for territory, for a plan that has been mastered for years and years. There's many reasons, but ultimately I consider that it is very important to precisely share with our family members, friends, this kind of discussion, so as to not only tag along, as we started this discussion on, oh, poor people, and that's it, but to really understand what the context of the situation is, make an informed decision as to where you stand with this. We offer a solution, stand for principles, stand for what is best for all. No war can ever be justified. And that is already standing with human rights principles. We want dignity for people. We want to provide a living income for everyone so that no one can be in poverty and joining military forces or terrorism, which is the same in the end, and stop all wars through these means. So, any further perspectives, guys?
No, I think that wraps it up very well.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm quite satisfied.
So we've reached the hour. Thanks a lot to everyone watching. To everyone that didn't catch the live transmission, please place your comments, questions in the Hangout that will be on YouTube, as always. And please make yourself heard, not only with us, but with everyone around you. This Hangout was precisely created so that we can expand the discussion from what is going on in mainstream media to assist others into, giving that step to consider beyond what is being mostly presented, to not give into this idea that, oh, this will lead to World War III and World War on terrorism. Stop participating in that kind of fear-mongering and rather take a stand for what is best for all. Thank you very much, guys, for being with us today.
Thank you.
And thank you to the viewer. Tomorrow we will have our regular schedule Hangout, so please keep an eye on that. Until next time.